Okay.
This is really great.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
It's really cool.
How'd you like seeing the Cisco and Ebert review again?
That was great. I think I went to see it
great
because
review.
of their review. Because I
Oh,
wasn't
they
assigned
made
to.
this film.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't get assigned to review it, so.
Yeah, they really made the film.
Huh? Kevin?
They're all gonna leave.
No, they're not gonna leave. Okay, it's time for the Golden Thumb. We have a tradition. We have a tradition at this festival where we give a golden thumb, and you had already gotten 2 thumbs up on the screen. May we present this to you? A casting of Roger's thumb, actually.
That is so great.
Okay, he's gonna take a picture of you.
I can't even, I suppose I have a speaker.
We'll take this.
I can't even tell you what that means. They made this movie. I mean, I made the movie, but they made it a hit. They did. So it was great. Thank you.
And we're going to have a Q&A session with you, with Michael Phillips, let's call him out, and Susan Wasina.
Oh, my. So I go over here.
We will all have a microphone? Yes.
Okay. I have things too, you know. I didn't want to.
Have you really not seen that film in a long time?
I haven't seen it in years. Yeah.
Oh, got it, got it. How
And
do-
I haven't seen it on film in many years.
And let's hear it for the actual
Wasn't it beautiful?
film, actual film. Let me ask first, every project has a long gestation before shooting begins. This one had probably longer than average, 7 years. Tell us a little bit about how many...
7 years was for me, but it was 17 years for Calder. And he wrote the first script in just a couple of weeks, and then it really didn't go. And he was just sort of passed over, and you know that everybody was afraid of an ovarectomy. That was really what it was. And
Not the scene with Lucas Haas and the.
well, that's what the doctor's doing. He's gonna
No, I mean Lucas, the boy and her in the bed, I thought. might
Oh, that's
also-
one, because, well, in fact, Rennie hid in his hotel because we were in North Carolina and he thought he was going to get kicked out of the U.S. But really, why would they even know what we were doing? That's
Right.
what I said, but it was scary for a minute.
We should back up and talk about this. Really the financing finally came together
Yes.
when Laura Dern approached Rennie Harlan. Is that
Well,
right?
Rennie was her boyfriend, and he read it and loved it. He wanted to direct it, but then she said, no, Martha's directing it. So he said, well, I'll produce it. And then it took a little while for him to get all the ducks together, and he finally went to Carolco and said, would they finance it? And they're all Europeans, and they said, sure.
But it's funny, I mean, Rennie usually did action films.
Yes.
He was working on Die Hard 2 by then, and, well, good for him.
He'd done Die Hard 2, I think. He was working on the cave one.
The cave.
Yeah, where they're caves or something.
I didn't see that one, I don't think.
Which one? Cliffhanger.
That's
Oh,
it. Cliffhanger.
It was the cliff one.
The cliff one.
Cliff one.
So I have to admit something. When I saw it in 1991, I wasn't quite prepared at that age to, take
Yeah.
this all in, and it kind of made me uneasy
Yep.
You know, and even though you're laughing, but you're like, should I be laughing? I don't know. And I saw it again before I came here, and I realized, you know, I kind of focused on Laura Dern's character a lot and how I would feel in her position. But now I realize I relate to Diane Ladd and Robert Duvall so much. And what I love is, and I realized this time, or the last time I saw it, watching it, is that as you know, memorable as the bedroom scene is with Laura Dern and Lucas Haas, it's almost the parallel to my other favorite scene, which is the married couple in bed, and how they play that out. And you think, you know, she's, you know, really mad at him, but, you know, it ends so beautifully, and they end up making love. And it's like, that is like now my favorite scene. So I guess I grew up enough to appreciate this film.
Well, it's funny, that was the scene that I added.
I wondered if you
there.
added your own.
And I felt that it just needed to switch over
Yeah.
from the boy and the girl to the parents to end the movie, because they do the final battle, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so I wanted that. It was a scene, but all it was them in bed and they hear her come in, that's it. But I turned it into a whole other, because I wanted to establish in that scene what they had that was a flaw and what they had that was going to get them through it.
Yeah. Well, I think you sit there thinking that at some point Diane Ladd's character is going to get jealous or feel threatened.
Yeah.
And it's the complete opposite. She is just such a champion for her
It's true.
that it's so beautiful. And yet, you know, it could be kind of, you know, corny, and it wasn't at all. It was so heartfelt.
If I may I just read one thing that Laura Dern said years ago? This is at the time of the filming, or just after the release, I'm saying. It was great to have Martha understand the desires and needs of this woman, Rose. This is Laura Dern talking now at the Telluride premiere back in '91. The male characters in the movie misinterpret her motives, but the women understand her all the way through. And here's one thing that you said too that I'd love to get a couple of responses on. Talking about this film, Martha said it had so many things going against it. It was a small adult film. It was a period film, so everything cost more to get the details right for sets and costumes. And this was on about a $7 or $8 million budget or something like that. Even the smallest films are more complex. It involves sexuality in an honest way that you don't see in Hollywood. And there's also this prejudice against the South generally, although this was at the time of Driving Miss Daisy and other things coming in. And then finally this. It's a man's story, really. This is you.
Yeah.
The story of Buddy and how his life is totally changed by his relationship to women. The Rose character is almost a whisper of a character, a mystery, a fantasy. But unlike fantasy women in Hollywood, the fantasy woman of Calder Willingham is deeper, more complex. There was a risk that her character would be superficial, but Laura created a full character. Now talk to us about that, because it's a yes.
Well, it was, you know, it's funny. I think it says more when I say that I was told the original cast was going to be Lily Tomlin, Walter Matthau, and
Goldie Hawn.
Goldie Hawn, yeah.
Hawn. And when I heard that,
What a different film that would have been.
I realized, well, that's a different film.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, talk about a Cracker Barrel, you know.
Yeah. So to me, what Calder told me is Rose was an amalgam of all the girls that came to work for the family during the Depression. There were a lot of them. And so he just sort of put them together into one, but he stuck on certain qualities. And to me, it was perfect because her boundaries are not there. She had a father who messed around with her, and she wanted to be loved, and that's all she knew. And so she's looking for love through the whole movie. But what happens is she affects everyone, and they all find, as Calder said, true love, higher love. And he would always talk to me about higher love and lower love. And when you really look at this movie, it really is about both those things.
Well, go ahead, Susan.
Well, I was just so impressed with Lucas Haas, too, because that is probably the most difficult role. I mean, you're a young boy and God knows what, he knows. But how did you have to kind of coach him through things, or did it just come natural? He had Laura Dern in his bed for real, so.
He was, and you'd have to look at it again, but he is mimicking his father.
Oh, okay.
So I couldn't believe it. When I realized that, I said, oh my God. And he had all those things. He didn't have any sexual experience, but that doesn't matter. He was interested. And he talked and got very good friends with Laura. And so we did it in about week 4 or 5. So we really knew each other. And they were great. And they understood that it's an acting scene. And that's what they did.
You could say this of every film, but you could take the same script, and especially to your point about the casting, if you cast it differently, and I think, if you had the wrong man behind the camera, especially, you'd suddenly get the prurient side of this film, and it's all over Calder Willingham's work. I mean, he was good friends with Nabokov, and he worked on the Lolita screenplay, and he knows the squirmy kind of black comedy that is so rich and all this stuff, and it's in this material. But if you took the same material and directed it differently, it would be an utterly different and lesser experience.
Totally. And the thing that's really great is he was incredibly honest about Lucas. That was him, and he was very honest about everything he says. He's not dishonest. I mean, sometimes he'd sort of exaggerate one thing and not tell another thing, but and it was great. It was refreshing, and they both were. And she is so hung up on the father that she isn't even.
His head, but other things.
And Duvall had to be convinced by a letter from Willingham, right?
Yeah,
to take the role.
he was going to do it, and then he changed his mind because he didn't know me, didn't know Rennie, and he just backed out. And then Calder wrote him a letter. I have no idea what it said, but it was probably the last really good guy, Bobby played, and he was really a good guy, and he said to me when I said, well, those moments when you're attracted to Rose, it isn't in the script, but we'll find those. And he looked at me and he said, what are you talking about? I'm a good man. I said, oh, you're a good man, but you're attracted to her. And he just hadn't thought of it. And the next day it was there.
Really? Well, the movie has to hit 2 notes simultaneously almost throughout. And can you talk to us a little bit about finding what it takes for you, beyond intuition, to find the tone that can manage the shift the story takes, where you get a very dark turn and potentially this tragic outcome for Rose averted? But
I guess I didn't think of it that way, but what I did know is that it is a very honest film. And though my father had, in the 30s, he had hormone treatments, which were supposed to treat nervous breakdowns or something. And I was told that, they did a lot of these things in the South because they felt that a girl who had, who was a nymphomaniac had to be operated on, and it's horrifying. And to me, it was very, very important because we are raised with this history. Women have had this stuff done to them for hundreds of years. And to me, it was very important that someone took up her champion, and it was Mother. It was Diane. It wasn't Father. He agrees with her finally, but because he doesn't see it. He's seeing a man's side, and he doesn't see it. But then he saw it, and I think that it's Mother's, every point she makes about Rose is right. She was, that's all she had. That's how she looked for love. And to take love away from her, what a terrible thing.
So, well, the one moment I appreciated too is how you showed how Mr. Right was not so right. And the minute he says, "Oh, honey, barbecue has more meats," and you're like, "Oh, no." But I also want to ask what this meant to your career, because you did do 2 comedies.
I did, and that was good, but
What
that was
this,
teen comedies.
Right.
And I didn't even see anything else.
But you must have been overjoyed, not just with this cast doing it, but just for yourself.
I was, and that was 4 years or 5 years before I did it. I got it, and I just said, oh my God, somebody's probably gotten this. And I was freaking out, but in fact, many people had it and tried to make it, but they couldn't.
Yeah. Well, I talked to Amy Heckerling about the anniversary of Ridgemont High, and I realized, at this time, actually studios were kind of open to having women directors, well,
A few.
well, there was Penny comedies, yes, which is weird, but just doing that. But Penny Marshall, Betty Thomas, Nancy Myers, Nora Ephraim, Susan Seidelman. So
But they hadn't done anything before this, I don't think.
well, I mean, during that time,
Yeah.
I'm just saying that studios, it wasn't all independent.
Kuroko was
stuff.
afraid, because once they thought they didn't think it was shocking, and then I got flowers and little notes, and
Well, I was just saying
all this stuff.
their own comedies, that they had hits and they did well and they went on. And also this year, they had Thelma and Louise, Brian Green Tomatoes, Silence of the Lambs, and Terminator 2 with a pumped up Linda Hamilton. So actually, it wasn't a bad year. I mean, for women, it wasn't probably perfect, but it was 1991 wasn't a bad year for female-led films.
did it come out in 91 or 90?
91, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, look, and I have to ask how, when you were working for American Zoetrope and Coppola, right, before you made Valley Girl,
Yeah.
did you have a sense? Did you have to reckon, just even internally, with the sense of like, okay, honestly, what are my options going to be in this industry at this time?
Well, maybe I'm just naive, but I didn't, only in thinking back do I realize I knew I was limited, but I didn't really think about it because I knew I could do it. And I really jumped at this film because it was, a dramedy. It's a dramedy. And I felt very close to it, partly due to my family, because they were New Englanders. They don't have the poetry of the South, but they, had the kind of background. And so I knew this film could, like I knew about Valley Girl, could open up a whole new career for me. And it did. And it was very important that I get it out.
So,
Go
no,
ahead, sorry.
this is just an aside, but I am delighted to hear you are related to Calvin Coolidge, our 30th president, and you held this office as well as the first and, for some reason, only woman
It's not some reason.
DG. But why did you only do it for a year? Because other
No, I
presidents
did it
do-
for 2 years,
Oh,
almost
2
2
years?
yeah.
Okay.
Which is a term.
But it's still shorter than most of them did.
Well, that's right, because they always give the president, almost always, a second term. And that's
Yeah.
when they do the stuff they really want to do.
Uh-huh.
But there were 3 or 4 men, only that, who really didn't want me to be president, and they weren't ready for it. And they kept thinking I was some kind of loose cannon when I wasn't. I had talking points. I was a really straight down the liner, DGA person.
You needed a Diane Ladd to get him out.
Well, that might have not helped. But anyway, so I did that, and I've helped a lot of women since.
Yeah.
But because of all my years, because of being schooled, I did do it, and I felt I had to because I was the only woman who could do it. I
Yeah.
knew that. And then I really had to go and take care of my career for a while because,
Yeah.
They don't pay.
Right.
It's just a volunteer.
Right, oh, okay.
Just one question about the ending, and then we'll get to audience questions. I remember an alternate
Oh, I
ending.
do have it on the DVD.
Yeah, on the DVD, there's an alternate ending, though. Could you explain what that is and kind of what led to the decision to this ending?
Well, what happened is we tested, and that's just testing, 6 different beginnings and endings. And I made many more than that. And that was because Kuroko was used to testing action pictures. And this picture kept getting a grade that was very good, but they didn't think it was good for them. So they wanted to explain more how she died and da-da-da. So we wrote it, and I did it, but I didn't want to put it, I didn't like it as well as the movie, and it didn't get better numbers. So I put it on the DVD so you could see more of what's going on, and it just changes the very ending, that ending in the, in the woods there.
I have to say, this feels like a very unfussed over picture in terms of the executive interference. It just feels like the scenes, you have scenes like, to your point, Susan, that scene, and it is one of my favorites, and I had forgotten how great it is, that scene between Duvall and Ladd is allowed to breathe and play out in a way that it does not feel like 2018.
No, and what I wanted to do there was give it a realistic transition to the parents and get a little bit more about them. It was fussed over, but in a different way. Kuroko isn't much of a micromanager. That's not what they do, but they were completely worried about the voiceover, and they made me do so many endings that I thought I might go mad. I did. And it was months. I mean, I must have worked over that for 4 or 5 months, and I had no money, and, it was just terrible. But finally, the marketing guy came up and said, "You win. Put it back the way it was." And that to me was like a good news, but it also was 5 months of my life. But, it did go back the way it was.
Let's hear from you folks. I'll take wherever the mic is nearest. We have several right there. How about right up the aisle there?
In the balcony in the center.
Right there.
Do you think that you could make this movie today being just a part of the events being just a part of a depiction of a time and place? Would you be able to make this today without turning everybody into a villain?
A villain?
Well, the guys.
Well, I wouldn't make it that way, but what I think is that I think that the child sexuality is an issue. It was a big issue in England, and they cut the scene. So I think that would change, and I think that it was the right time to really get into this subject and not later. So to me, it was best then, because I don't know how people would feel about it. I mean, it's great now, but I don't know. What do you think?
Go ahead. Nice, good and loud.
Overtaken by people criticizing the way that they...
Hold on, just 1 second. I'm sorry. We're back on.
The mic's
Can you just speak a little louder?
I think that it would be overtaken by people's criticism of the sexism and blaming the victim, et cetera. But it's a movie that I believe does reflect the attitudes of the time period,
Yes.
which you've allowed it to do, which I think was good.
Yeah, and I think that's very important, and I think that it is, right now, we're seeing a lot of that kind of criticism, and that, that'll probably change a little. It would be unfortunate to be making it right now. So, I think, you know, I love the men and the women, and they all learned something, and that's what you do with one of my mentors' words, the traveling angel picture, and she is a traveling angel, and she affects all their lives by coming into them.
We have another question to your right down here.
Right here.
Yes, this film was such a joy to watch with this audience, and I just love to hear a bit about working with the great Elmer Bernstein on the score and finding the right tone that you wanted musically to strike with the film.
Elmer Bernstein.
Yes.
Talk about your collaboration with the composer, Elmer Bernstein.
Well, what was funny is I had talked to Calder, and he said, why don't you get somebody like Elmer Bernstein? And so I thought to myself, well, what's he doing?
Smart.
So I found out who his agents were. I wrote him a letter. He wrote back. He said, let me see the film. And he came to see the film, and he came up to me, and he said, Martha, I would pay you to let me score this picture.
But he did with the music what you did with the
Oh, he
film,
was great.
with the tone and keeping it light when
Yeah.
it had to be, and making us feel things when we needed to.
And very American. It
Yeah,
was,
yeah.
you know, it was perfect, actually.
On the floor to your right again.
To the right.
It's me over here. Robert Duvall is one of my favorite actors, and and he's given so many great performances, but this is my favorite of performances. The scene where with the doctor, that scene. So the moment where he realizes the layers that's going on, and his relationship with his wife, with women, with his daughter. It's so beautifully feminist. It's like just gorgeous. I wondered if you could talk about working with Robert Duvall and that scene in particular. I mean, he's a genius, so I imagine, I don't know, his approach to that moment.
You know, it's a 12-page scene, so it's a very big scene. And because of who's in it, what I did, because Bobby had told me at the very beginning of the movie, if there's an emotional scene, then my close-up has to be first. It'll be good, it'll never be as good. And so what I did is I broke the 12-page scene into 3 days. So I did kind of 4 pages a day. And therefore, when I led up to him saying, you're right and I'm wrong, I had never done it. I hadn't done anything, hadn't rehearsed it, nothing. And so I started out and set up his close-up. We hadn't done anything else except, you know, 2/3 of the scene. And basically, we set it up. We had to have the rain going and all this stuff. And Diane was so angry, I can't even. She was angry because she felt she's old and she needs to look good, and this was her big Oscar moment. But the truth is, I knew that she was really tense about it and that she needed to relax. So what I did is at lunch, I went up and we had shot Bobby, and he did 1 take of the end. And I just looked at him and I said, you don't want to do that again, do you? Oh no, he said. So that was that. But then we did mediums and wides, and we moved around and got to her. And so what she did is she had rehearsed it a lot, and I did a lot of takes, and we did a lot with her. But the truth is, when she gotten sort of more worn down, and she was brilliant because she relaxed about it, and that was really important, and it worked out there. And I've worked with actors who are 1-take actors, and they have to be first, and the star of the movie may be somebody else, and they can't be first. But you can't tell them that, you know. So I said the studio was making me shoot him first, which was a lie, but it was the only thing I could say, because I knew that if Bobby wasn't great, we didn't have scene. And I felt she'd be better with a little more time, and she was. So it was funny, because we just divided it up, and I changed the master and the shots for each section of the scene, and that's how we did it.
We have time for one more question
Oh, this
in the
better be a
balcony.
pip.
In the balcony to your left.
Balcony left, right up there, okay.
Hi. So much about this movie was so gentle. We were talking about it up here. We were all just in it the whole time you were in it. Well, I would take a lot of like movies that I thought would be good for high schoolers to get different depictions. And I said, this is the first one that I've said this to students for years, that you actually said it in a movie, which is, it's not about the sex. It's about love. All these bad girls in high school that kids will talk about, I'll say the very same thing to them. Now, if you could just make another movie that also showed another depiction of those sorts of things, it would be just wonderful, because I'm going to sneak it in somehow in my late night high school video group so they can see that, because it was just, there was not a minute's doubt that it was just real life. It was not, made up for something. So we appreciate that. So could you make another movie is what I'm asking. Are you've got any other movies coming up that do such a similar kind of a job of creating just life as itself?
Well, let's talk about the one that's in post-production right now, which has been...
Well, the one that's in post-production right now is a love story that takes place before, during, and after World War II in Poland, Germany, and ends in New York City. And I wanted to do a movie that was very uplifting. They're musicians. There's lots of concerts. But she's Jewish and he's Catholic. And she's taken away to Auschwitz with her family. And we show things that we haven't seen yet in movies before. Things like the concentration camps being liberated and lots of things. And it's a very... and I felt they had to make love, because after all, he's looking for her for 4 years. That's a long time. And, you just have to keep looking at the honesty of the characters and at really what they feel at the time. And people don't know everything. They don't know what's coming, and does that sort of answer your question, actually? Oh, good.
Martha, from your first film, Not a Pretty Picture in 1975, which is fascinating and should be seen by a new generation, I think, up through Valley Girl and Real Genius and the film we just saw, and many more. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You were great. They were great.